Studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Friday, March 27th, 2015. Saudi Arabia launches airstrikes against Yemen, with U.S. backing threatening to touch off a wider regional war. We'll speak with Professor Stephen Zunes. And another draft chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is leaked to the public. We'll examine the latest efforts to put corporate power ahead of people and the planet. Plus a look at Australia's problematic Prime Minister. Professor Binoy Kampmark will dissect how Tony Abbott's tenure has impacted Aboriginal communities and refugees. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina. The 27-year-old pilot of the fatal Germanwings crash, Andreas Lubitz, apparently had a doctor's note to take a sick day, but hid it from his employer. Lubitz locked out his co-pilot and deliberately crashed his plane into the French Alps, killing himself and all 150 people on board. German authorities are investigating his psychological and medical background and whether he had any personal or financial problems to explain his motivation. French authorities are in the process of deciding whether to classify the incident as criminal, crazy, or suicidal. And German investigators say they have yet to find any kind of suicide note or anything of a, quote, political or religious nature. Christina, one can only imagine how such a tragedy would have been cast had the pilot's skin been of a different hue or his name been foreign sounding.
Yes, of course, Sonali. I think if that would have been the case, this conversation would be something that would have to do with so-called terrorism. And I'm not even sure, if religion would be important in that, but definitely you would see some discourse around criminal behavior and some. Even if the details weren't clear, you might still see some dialogue that would reflect some concerns about any kind of suspicious terrorist activities or anything like that.
And on Monday's program, we will take a look at this and other incidents through that lens. Indiana Governor Mike Pence has just signed a controversial bill into law that claims to protect the religious freedom of his state's residents, but has prompted fears of legalizing discrimination, particularly against the LGBT community. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is designed to allow private corporations to defend themselves if sued for discrimination that they say is based on their religious beliefs. Indiana's law is the first of a rash of similar bills in more than 20 states around the nation that has been signed into law. But outrage over the law is only beginning. Several businesses announced they would be boycotting Indiana over the law. In California, State Attorney General Kamala Harris is taking a stand against an even more disturbing initiative launched by an Orange County initiative. It's called the Sodomite Suppression Act, and it calls for executing gays. Well, Christina, do you see these efforts as a desperate right-wing backlash to the recent gay marriage victories in so many states, and even to an extent at the Supreme Court?
Sure, I definitely do think that, look, anytime we have progress, there's always going to be a backlash. And we see that there's a long list of different civil rights that marginalized groups have been able to historically have been able to fight for. But when that happens, there's a backlash. And so we see that with issues of voting rights, for instance. And so I think here's another example of that. And, I think it's interesting, these issues, because let's take the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, for example. Apparently this has some roots in protecting Native Indigenous religious freedoms. But the same people who would be using this Restoration Act probably don't care about protecting Native, Indigenous, or religious freedoms, or Muslims, for instance, right? And so we have to ask, what interests are being maintained when we even talk about these so-called religious freedoms, and what that means about discrimination for marginalized groups.
And finally, the Republican-controlled Senate stayed up all night to discuss and vote on a federal budget that was passed at 3 a.m. this morning. The budget predictably hands tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy and cuts more than $5 trillion in services that most ordinary Americans need and rely on. And top Senate Democrat Harry Reid of Nevada just announced he's retiring. The Liberal Democrat had been targeted for years by Tea Party activists, and his announcement is likely to set off an election frenzy. And finally, in an extremely rare show of bipartisanship, the House yesterday approved major changes to Medicare that rewards doctors financially for the quality of their care rather than quantity and expands a popular child health insurance program. The historic 392-37 vote was so rare that President Obama called House Speaker John Boehner to congratulate him. Christina, does the contrast between the Senate budget bill and the House Medicare vote indicate that Republicans can indeed do their jobs, but only if they actually decide to?
Well, sure. I mean, and I think it's, they can do their jobs if their interests are being upheld. It means something for them, meaning more profits, right? And so the cutting taxes for the wealthy and at the same time cutting programs that are really important for many hundreds of people in this country to survive, especially in the economy that we've been living in. And so, that needs to be talked about a lot more. The media needs to be on this, and it's urgent. And so I think this is a conversation that we should have more of.
And of course, the House
really
vote
important.
did demonstrate that when they care about a certain issue, they can actually come together. So it's interesting to see that contrast. I want to thank you so much, Cristina, for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Yemen, the poorest nation in the Arab world, has become the focus of a new regional war. After a Shiite rebellion calling itself the Houthis drove President Abed Rabu Mansour Hadi to flee to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis this week began bombing Yemen as part of their Operation Decisive Storm. If the name of the operation is reminiscent of a U.S. military campaign, it's because the U.S. is working closely with its Saudi allies in planning and logistics. At least 25 people have died so far in Yemen from the bombings. Saudi Arabia's main worry is the expansion of Iranian influence. Iran's Shia leadership is suspected of supporting the Houthi rebellion. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani condemned the military intervention, even as Houthi spokespeople denied Iranian support. To make matters more complicated, the Houthis are supporting Ahmed Ali Abdullah Saleh, the son of Yemen's former dictator, who was deposed by the Arab Spring Revolution as a new potential leader. My guest is Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he directs a program in Middle Eastern studies. Hi, Stephen.
Hello.
Well, the situation is extremely complex. Let's start with what the Houthis plan for Yemen. They've taken control of the capital, Sana'a, and they're controlling large swaths of Yemen's population centers. If left to their own devices, are they planning on holding elections, taking control of the democratic process, or are they simply hoping to reinstate a dictatorship?
It's hard to say. They are a historically oppressed minority, at least in recent decades. They took up arms initially to challenge the authoritarian Saleh regime and their efforts to consolidate control in their area in the north. But they've gone well beyond their initial rebellions, defending their tribal areas. to actually move in and take over the capital of Sana'a, effectively deposing the president, and then advancing south into areas where they and their co-religionists have not historically been. A number of people who were once sympathetic to some of their initial grievances are concerned, that they've gone well beyond that, and it may indeed be in league with the former dictator that they used to oppose. Personally, I think the charges of Iranian intervention are exaggerated. There are unconfirmed reports that some arms have been shipped via Iran, but as we've seen in the case of Bahrain, when that broad-based pro-democracy movement, nonviolent pro-democracy struggle was condemned as an Iranian plot, the Saudis and others, have this tendency to find Iranian conspiracies where there aren't any. But in any case, I think their strength comes not that they have a majority support, they are a minority, but because those that oppose them are so divided, and because the Hadi government has so little credibility.
Right. Well, so you're saying that it's debatable how important Iran's role is in this, but certainly Iran seems to be at least giving moral support to the Shia rebellion. And it's interesting to see that Iran is fighting on the same side of the United States and Iraq in the battle for Tikrit against the Islamic State. Here in Yemen, Iran's on the opposite side, while the U.S. is aligning with Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Iran are having nuclear talks this week, ongoing nuclear talks, part of a series of talks that have been happening for several weeks and months. This is a complicated mess where Iran is concerned, and the U.S.
Very much so. I mean, part of it is that Iran, for better or worse, is a regional power. And the Bush administration, to a certain extent the Clinton administration, seemed to be in denial, trying to isolate Iran, trying to think that we could basically bully them into compliance. And while there are certainly legitimate grievances on any number of policies, both foreign and domestic, by that rather reactionary clerical government, I think that I do at least give the Obama administration credit to recognizing the reality that they have to work together in areas where they have mutual interests, and oppose oppose Iran, where they see their policies as detrimental.
Well, if Iran is not overtly supporting the Houthis, who is providing them with arms, for example?
Well, again, it's very possible that there could be arms of Iranian origin. At the same time, it's important to recognize that Yemen is awash with arms. In fact, they have more guns per capita than any country in the world, except, of course, the United States. They've been in a constant state of tribal war, of ideological conflicts, a secessionist movement. It's very easy to get a hold of weapons there. And
actually, just earlier this month, the Pentagon admitted that the U.S. military had lost $500 million worth of arms in Yemen that they had supposedly provided, in the early part of the decade. And of course, we should remind ourselves that Yemen is one of the places where the U.S. routinely drops drone bombs. Is it possible that the Houthis are simply fighting the Saudis, and both sides are in effect using U.S. weapons? Saudi Arabia is one of the U.S.'s biggest weapons buyer, and the Houthis might have gotten them from these so-called lost weapons.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, the United States, of course, has been the #1 provider of arms to that volatile region for decades now, and it's yet another reminder in addition to many of the moral and legal questions about the wisdom of the United States, sending so many weapons to an area that is so unstable.
And Stephen, how unusual is it for Saudi Arabia to lead such a military operation? We don't really hear of Saudi Arabia launching wars. Apparently they had been in talks. We're now hearing reports they had been in talks with the U.S. for months and weeks, considering such a thing, and then, launched it this week when the Houthis became close to taking over the capital. Is this something that Saudi Arabia is sort of looking for a new role in the region?
Well, it's not really new. Saudi Arabia and Egypt fought a proxy war in Yemen during the early 1960s. The Saudis have bombed the Houthis several years ago when they had one of their initial rebellions. Saudi Arabia, of course, invaded Bahrain, allying with the more reactionary elements of that monarchy and suppressing the pro-democracy movement back in 2011. There have been the Saudis supported South Yemeni secessionists when they tried to break away and reestablish a separate country in South Yemen back in 1994. There have also been a number of border clashes where Saudi Arabia has seized some oil reserves in some disputed border areas. So Saudi intervention in Yemen is not new, though the level of this intervention is bigger than we've seen in the past.
Right. It's taken a more direct approach, a more overt approach, naming its campaign Operation Decisive Storm, like the U.S. names their campaigns. There's also reportedly a coalition of Gulf countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain. Just to take Morocco apparently joined this coalition, the UAE. What are the interests, Stephen, of some of these governments to align themselves against Yemen? Is there a fear of similar rebellions hitting their own countries and sort of reflecting the kind, except it's easier to align against this sort of rebellion than it was, at least overtly, than it was against the Arab Spring democracy movements?
Oh, certainly there is interest in trying to stop a rebellious movement, one that is aligned with dissident Shia elements in other countries. But what's disturbing about this is that the United States is supporting this effort, even though every nation that you have mentioned here is an authoritarian regime.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just a few years ago. Yemen was a bright spot. You had this massive pro-democracy, broad-based, non-violent movement where people in this heavily armed...
Stephen? And we're going to try to get Stephen back on with us as he describes the brief history of Yemen's Arab Spring Revolution, where the broad coalition overthrew Saleh, the dictator then, and elections led to Mr. Hadi, the current president, who's currently in exile. Stephen, you were saying?
I'm sorry, I don't know where we got cut off.
You were describing the Arab Spring Revolution and the hope and the
Yes.
bright spot that it represented for Yemen.
Yes, and unfortunately what the United States did along with the Saudis is they encouraged this effort by the Gulf monarchies to bring in the authoritarian dictator Saleh's vice president, Hadi, as the only candidate in an election, basically dismissing and ignoring a civil society. And of course, Hadi's rule, though it is the legally legitimate, recognized government of Yemen, never got a lot of support. Didn't have a lot of legitimacy. Was seen as quite corrupt, and Saleh and his influence remained to some degree. And so when you marginalize civil society and they feel they don't have a stake in the process, it creates a power vacuum in which the men with guns end up playing a role. So there you have the rise of the Houthis, you have a rise of al-Qaeda elements and even ISIS. And now you're having this intervention by these authoritarian regimes, again, backed by the United States. The only bright spot I've seen is the reports just yesterday that when the Houthis tried to seize Taiz, the second largest city, in their march south below Sana'a, many tens of thousands of people took to the streets non-violently to resist the impending assault, and the Houthis backed down. Huh. So it shows even amidst all the chaos, the craziness, the violence, the various armed groups, there are still people in Yemen willing to engage in massive nonviolent resistance to assert their right to self-governance and to resist these armed groups that are trying to push them around.
And it's interesting, these protests haven't received as much coverage, of course, in the West because they tend not to. Those are the kinds of things that tend not. And so when we try to understand Middle East politics, we hear about them or learn about them in a vacuum. Can the bombing campaign led by Saudi Arabia and, of course, backed very closely by the United States have the opposite effect of rallying more support around the Houthis as they tend to then represent the defenders see themselves as the defenders of Yemen against these foreign invaders?
Yes, it could. It could also end up strengthening al-Qaeda and extremist Salafi Sunni groups as well. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a very good reputation in Yemen. Millions of Yemens have been foreign guest workers in Saudi Arabia where they have been horribly abused, mistreated. And Saudi Arabia has played a bullying role over the years in terms of intervention and the like. Even though the Houthi advance is not well appreciated, is opposed by most Yemenis, that doesn't mean they necessarily welcome Saudi intervention either.
Right. The oil prices in Yemen, in the Gulf region in general, jumped a little bit yesterday as a result of the Saudi operation. Yemen controls an important oil route. How serious is the potential of this conflict spreading? What is the possibility of the Saudis sending in ground troops?
Well, the threat of ground troops is a real one. They have been quite explicit about their willingness to do that. Egypt has threatened to send in some troops as well. In terms of oil prices, probably not that big a deal. Yemen has only a few oil fields, nothing much. As you mentioned at the outset, it is a very poor country. It's very different than the other 6 countries of the Arabian Peninsula, both in its poverty and also as a republic, not a monarchy. Aden is an important seaport, but the fighting has not gotten there as much. In terms of spreading, there are restive Shia minorities in Saudi Arabia. The Shia majority in Bahrain continues to be oppressed by the U.S. and Saudi-backed regime there. One could conceivably see military intervention in Yemen against the Houthis, stimulating protests there. There have been some nonviolent protests already in Bahrain and Qatar and a couple other places regarding this. And it's unfortunate, too, because, there have been a whole number of cleavages in Yemen and elsewhere. As in a number of countries, the sectarian split, the Sunni-Shia split, is something that's fairly recent, and I think a reflection of a number of new developments in the area where the divide and rule policies of both the United States and various governments in that part of the world have made this a much bigger deal than it was just a couple decades ago.
Well, Stephen Zunes, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Stephen Zunes is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he directs the program in Middle Eastern Studies. This is Uprising. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. WikiLeaks has just leaked a chapter of the secret international trade deal, Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. President Obama has long championed the TPP as a major part of its global economic policy platform, but the New York Times has analyzed the WikiLeaks document and concluded that if signed into law, the TPP would enable foreign companies to sue the U.S. government if their businesses were hurt. According to the Times, quote, under the accord still under negotiation but nearing completion, companies and investors would be empowered to challenge regulations, rules, government actions, and court rulings, federal, state, or local, before tribunals organized under the World Bank or the United Nations. The leaked chapter is an indication of the ongoing push from major multinational corporations that seek to expand their power at the expense of ordinary people and governments. Part of that expansion is a new merger announced this week of two major food companies, Heinz and Kraft Foods. The new mega company will become the fifth largest food company in the world. My guest is Patrick Woodall, Research Director and Senior Policy Advocate for Food and Water Watch, a public policy analyst, researcher, and advocate on economic justice issues in Washington, and co-author of a book on the World Trade Organization. Welcome to Uprising, Patrick.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, let's turn to the TPP and this new chapter on investment that was leaked to WikiLeaks. The New York Times described these extremely broad powers that this chapter outlines. But what is an example of what could happen if this version of the TPP is realized and becomes law? What are the sorts of worst-case scenarios we could see in the U.S. in the future?
Well, the new chapter confirms pretty much our worst fears about the negotiations. It does empower foreign companies to challenge any law that they believe indirectly expropriates their profits. And that means really what they call a reasonable investment expectation. So that could be any kind of very common sense public health, environment, or consumer protection that actually infringed on future earnings. So if you were a polluting company and a law was passed to curtail that pollution, that would infringe on your investment expectations. And the company would be empowered in new powerful ways to bring a challenge against that state or local or federal government for damages. They could sue for money damages to get the government to change its law to eliminate the protection or to pay out a giant sum of money. And so far, under NAFTA and other trade deals the U.S. has signed, trade tribunals have already imposed almost $4 billion in penalties for these kinds of investor-to-state disputes, which are a huge threat to democracy and a threat to kind of the growing movement on empowering people to really take control of their own lives.
I mean, it sounds as though corporations believe they have a right to profits. But they don't have a right. I mean, that makes no ethical sense. It makes no moral sense. And up until recently, it didn't make much legal sense either.
Well, I mean, this really calls into question some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House. They've said that it's no different than under U.S. law and that U.S. companies actually can do the same thing. But that's only true in the real property sense. So originally, these investment measures were designed to ensure that if a company's land was seized by a government for, a new highway or something, they would have the same sort of eminent domain rights that you would have in the U.S. So if we ran a right-of-way through someone's land, they have to be compensated for that. But these are new kind of versions of this that actually expand those ordinary investment rights to a whole range of hypothetical and future expected earnings rights on a regulatory takings area, which is not the case under U.S. law. And so it is a huge expansion of the power for foreign companies to actually challenge local laws. Now, look, I mean, we're concerned about this on a host of things. This will affect things on food labeling. It'll affect the growing movement across the country to fight fracking for natural gas. There are 250 communities across the country that have passed bans or moratoriums on fracking within their boundaries, including New York State. And these could all be threatened by international trade tribunals where foreign natural gas companies could challenge a local ordinance. This is not a hypothetical problem. Already there's been a case under NAFTA where a natural gas company has challenged the Canadian province of Quebec's moratorium, which is in place for them to study the impact of fracking on the St. Lawrence River system. So this is a real problem, and we have people across the country that are fighting to protect their communities from natural gas expansion with dangerous fracking, which pollutes their water and communities. And this is a way for the companies to do an end run around local government.
And some have characterized the TPP as NAFTA on steroids. I mean, essentially what it sounds like to me that you're saying that if we summarize is the TPP essentially puts corporate interests over the interests of people and the planet. I mean, I can't think of any other way to put it. Is that a good way to look at it?
That's absolutely right. It prioritizes corporate interests over the public interest. And this particular chapter, these investment provisions, are really the tip of the spear on this. It gives companies an express right to bring these challenges on their own. Under the World Trade Organization, if there are commercial disputes, they are brought from nation to nation. The U.S. government challenges another government's rules. Under this, it just eliminates all that and allows the companies themselves to take action into their own hands. So there's not even that element where the government chooses to do it, which has a little bit of protection from democracy. But this is just allows the companies to run roughshod over local governance worldwide. And
we are able to have this discussion because somebody leaked a copy of this chapter to WikiLeaks. They're doing these discussions in private and secret. How does the Obama administration justify this? I mean, we've already eviscerated this idea that the Obama administration is the most transparent in history, its claim, and in so many other ways, of course, it's the least transparent. But in this as well, it seems to be holding fast to its lack of transparency.
They're actually quite insistent on the lack of transparency, and they've made it very difficult even for members of Congress to get access to the text as it's being negotiated. This recent leak actually highlights this in a very appalling way. Included in the investment chapter that was leaked by WikiLeaks, there is a 4-year confidentiality clause inside the investment provision, which says this investment rules cannot be shared with the public for 4 years after either the trade deal goes into effect or the negotiations fail. So even these provisions are so damaging and so demonstrate the kind of corporate power that these trade deals are based on that they don't even want to share it with the public until long after it's gone into effect.
Now, people pushing the TPP have been very optimistic for years that negotiations on the final language would wrap up and that the governments of all of the countries, because there's a number of countries involved here, not just 3 like NAFTA, that the governments of all these would vote on it and it would become the new international trade deal. How close is the TPP from being finalized and voted on here in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Well, I think the negotiations have been much slower than anybody would have wanted that's pushing this deal. They're down to a few areas of contention, but they are contentious areas, I think. So they have been having meetings and ministerials on this, but it is not moving as quickly as they anticipated. They thought this would be wrapped up a few years ago, and it's still ongoing. It's a 12-nation pact all around the Pacific, so Australia, Canada, Chile, the U.S., Southeast Asian nations. So it's a big pact that has a lot of complexity to it, but it is not finished yet. In the U.S., it doesn't appear that this deal will come to the congressional floor in the next weeks or even months. And in fact, they're trying to push a retrograde way of approving this deal, rubber stamping the deal known as fast track right now. But even that has kind of slowed down a little bit in recent months.
Patrick, let's turn to the other story that exemplifies the increase in corporate power. You work at Food and Water Watch, and 2 major food companies, one of them especially major, Kraft Foods, announced a merger this week with Heinz. And these are 2 companies which together would basically make the 5th largest food company in the world. How is this going forward? What are your concerns for it?
Well, I think it was announced just recently this week, and it will go forward, I expect, pretty rapidly. These are big companies, right? Within the U.S., this is the 4th biggest Kraft and the 11th biggest Heinz, and they would have as much as $22 billion in sales and domestically. So they're huge companies. I mean, they're sprawling. They have a sprawling presence inside the supermarket that many consumers may not know. I mean, obviously, Kraft is macaroni and cheese and salad dressing and Velveeta and whatnot, but it also owns a host of brands that people might not think of as Kraft brands, like Maxwell House Coffee or Claussen Pickles. Heinz is sort of a similar but smaller company. It also owns not just ketchup, but Ore-Ida potato products and Weight Watchers frozen dinners and things like that. So we're very concerned about the impact this has on consumers, because it's really changing the choice that consumers have and making it considerably harder for consumers to know who owns what they're buying and what the control is like within the supermarket, which ultimately really diminishes choice and has the real potential to raise prices over the long term for consumers.
How is this not seen as violating antitrust laws? I mean, we're supposed to have these laws in place to prevent mergers, but corporations seem to find ways around them. Is it that the two companies say that they produce products that don't compete with one another, so it's okay?
Well, that's basically in a nutshell what it is. And the Federal Trade Commission, which oversees these mergers, likes to look at these cases through a very, very narrow lens. They want the companies to compete on nearly identical products. There's a kind of infamous case where they only wanted to look at very strong mints, and one company did not produce very strong mints, the other did, and so they didn't view this as a competition problem. In this particular merger, it's a merger of two conglomerates that produce various kinds of foods, but they do compete on a couple of narrow areas. So Kraft produces A1 steak sauce, and Heinz produces Lee and Perrins Worcestershire sauce. And in those cases, there is a direct competition. The problem is there are many other places where there are kind of complementary goods that are produced. So Kraft also produces Grey Poupon mustard and Claussen pickles, and Heinz produces ketchup. And in theory, this is going to change the way that people shop for things at the barbecue, right? So it does have a real competitive impact. And more broadly, what we're looking at is a kind of wave of mega mergers in the food industry. There were $100 billion worth of food and beverage mergers in 2014. And in the past couple of months, we've seen a merger between Bumblebee Tuna and Chicken of the Sea Tuna. Smucker's bought the company that owns Milk-Bone and Meow Mix. There's a big breakfast cereal merger between Post and Malta-Meal, which is being proposed. So it's a big deal. And throughout the supermarket, we see fewer and fewer firms that are controlling, that have their tentacles all over the supermarket. What this means is we have really an illusion of choice. You stand in the supermarket and it looks like there are an infinite number of brands, but the reality is those brands are really controlled by a few firms, and that control prevents new companies from selling new, more natural or products that people may want that are emerging, because it's much easier for Kraft to control real estate in the supermarket because they can sell a huge variety of things. We did a study that found that Kraft was present in 22 of 100 kinds of grocery products, and Heinz was present in 7. And in many cases, they're the dominant player. So it's 80% of macaroni and cheese is by Kraft, and half the processed cheese, and a third of the mayonnaise, and a third of the lunch meat. So they have a huge presence, and this merger will join companies that will spread their power throughout even more of the supermarket.
Right. Doesn't that also make it harder for smaller food companies to break in? I mean, you know, there's a growing awareness around food related to the impact on public health. And when you have smaller companies that are trying to put foods on the shelves, to be able to compete with these larger and larger companies, not only for the costs, but for shelf space, it makes it much more difficult, doesn't it?
So I think that's really what we're talking about. This is it's very hard for new food entrants to get into the marketplace. And, you know, they're competing for the real estate in the supermarket, which is the shelf space, and it's the promotional space and the ability to advertise in store. And all of those things are constrained when you have a huge, huge company that controls so much space. And they work in very close alignment with the supermarkets, who are also merging. We just had a big Albertson Safeway merger that was approved by the Federal Trade Trade Commission. So, it creates this cascade of mergers. The supermarkets get bigger and they have more power over the manufacturers. The manufacturers merge so that they have better deal with the supermarkets and the people they buy supplies from. And the kind of supplier companies merge so they can cope with the manufacturers. All these companies in the middle are getting bigger in a wave after wave of mergers. And the reality is that we have about 2 million American farmers, 310 million eaters, and just a tiny handful of firms in the middle that make all the choices and extract all the value from the food chain.
And of course, when they merge, it increases the drive to cut costs further, which then leads to using cheaper ingredients that are worse for our health, and all of these very much a part of the conversation around public health. Well, I want to thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us today and helping to shed some light on the ways in which corporate interests are trumping the public interest. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Thanks. Patrick Woodall is Research Director and Senior Policy Advocate for Food and Water Watch, and a public policy analyst, researcher, and advocate on economic justice issues in Washington. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Australia is considered one of the U.S.'s main allies in the English-speaking world, but the Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott's increasingly belligerent rhetoric on a number of policy fronts has made him an embarrassing bedfellow of the West. On top of his vehement climate denialism, Abbott has recently been criticized for the appalling treatment of imprisoned asylum seekers that are held on the Pacific islands of Nauru and Manus. Mistreatment of prisoners includes sexual abuse, rape, and physical assault. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, singled out Australia for its abuse of children asylees in particular, to which Prime Minister Abbott responded that he was, quote, sick of being lectured to. Abbott has also come under fire recently for policies and comments targeting his nation's indigenous population. His administration has pushed severe cuts to Aboriginal legal services. Those cuts were just reversed after public outrage, but comments that Abbott made earlier in the month underscore the poor relations his government has had with indigenous communities. Abbott claimed it was not the responsibility of taxpayers to subsidize the, quote, lifestyle choices of Aboriginal people who live on remote lands and need services. Joining me now is Dr. Binoy Kampmark. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies and writes for counterpunch.org, and is joining us from Australia, where it's the middle of the night. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Binoy Kampmark, and thanks so much for waking up so late to do this interview.
It's a pleasure being with you.
Well, first let's talk about the problems with the refugees and detention. How serious is this? Can you give us a sense of how big the imprisoned population is, where they come from, and why they're held in these island facilities to begin with?
Well, yes, the population runs in the hundreds, and they're dispersed through a particular detention system that the Australian government has adopted over the years. Throughout the latter part of the 90s and then the early part of the last decade, there was a system that was developed. It was known as the Pacific Solution, as it was termed, and then it subsided somewhat, and then it was revived, and it was to deal with a particular arrival of groups of people from certain countries. They tended to come from, interestingly enough, from particular war zones that also had Australian involvement, namely Afghanistan, namely Iraq, and in some cases the southern part, in terms of Sri Lanka and so forth. So we've got a range of individuals who have sought refuge via various channels, and they have adopted a rather dangerous route, of course, of transiting through, for example, Indonesia, and then seeking a refuge in Australia. But the response of the government has been very hardline, and that is to use this detention camp system, which is something like as I've called it, a crude gulag archipelago, as it were, if you like, dealing with these individuals.
And some of the stories of not just the abuse, but the way in which the desperate means by which the asylum seekers are trying to get attention are very depressing. The abuses involve sexual abuse and rape and assault and very poor physical conditions. Can you give our audience a sense of why there are these problems? I mean, is this just an issue of a lack of oversight?
If only it was just that. It's not. It's a fundamental problem in the way that individuals are being treated. The reality is that these particular camps are run by the private sector. They're actually outsourced by the government. They're not even actually run by Australian contractors. They're run by contractors that are hired by the Australian government to perform services in line with certain supposed standards, and these particular companies then operate in accordance with what the PNG authorities do, for example, in Manus Island, Papua New Guinea authorities and so forth. So the reality is that the conditions are very poor. They are desperate. There is no sense that these particular individuals are being processed at speed and particular, with expeditiousness. And there is also, remember, and this is a very important point, the desperation also comes out because there's an incessant emphasis in the Australian context that individuals who are declared to be refugees, who are found to be refugees, will not settle in Australia. And that's the very significant thing. The desperation arises because of absurd remarks being made as well, that because, notwithstanding the fact that individuals are processed legitimately and found to be refugees, the government line in Canberra in Australia is that these people will not settle in Australia. And the absurd idea that they would settle, for example, in PNG or Nauru, which is a very small island with poor infrastructure to begin with, is quite absurd. So this is the general condition that we tend to see the individuals, in terms of how they deal with this.
Right, and for our American audience, PNG is Papua New Guinea. Now, let's talk about the ways in which this population of asylees, and some of them are children, have tried desperately to get the world's attention. I mean, it seems as though they've been locked up and forgotten because they're held outside Australia. Even the Australian public, I think, doesn't have to face very often what's happening inside. Earlier this year, we heard reports of refugees being held at Manus Island, having sewn their mouths shut. I mean, I just couldn't believe this when I saw pictures of this. It was very, very dramatic and very powerful and very disturbing.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is very disturbing, and it's one of those things that has been treated in a rather interesting way by the Australian, I suppose, dare I call it the anti-refugee establishment, the general line from government, and that is simply that these people are attention seekers, that they are not really appropriate to be admitted to Australia because they are performing these moral hysterics and so forth. And I'm not putting words in the mouths of officials. I mean, essentially the perspective here is that these individuals are legitimately detained. They're being legitimately processed on offshore manner that is considered acceptable, and that this particular approach of desperation is being put down to, for example, and this is a theme that you will encounter, the effect of NGOs, non-government organizations, refugee groups, and so forth, who are encouraging, and this is from the previous immigration minister, Scott Morrison, and then the current immigration minister, who's suggesting that actually refugees are being encouraged to do this because they know that they're going to get attention. So we got a situation where effectively psychological desperation and agony is being treated with considerable disdain by the suits in Canberra, if you
Right,
like.
as if they're just doing some kind of political theater. What does Abbott's reaction to the United Nations concerns about these clear human rights violations mean? Is his administration contemptuous of the United Nations in the same way that many reactionary U.S. politicians have been, because they don't like the idea of having to answer to an international body? And I should just remind, he said that he was sick of being lectured to when Juan Mendez, the special rapporteur, called attention to the treatment of child refugees.
Yes, I think the comparison you draw with, between Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Australia and, certain groups in the United States who are concerned that their sovereignty is being clipped away by individuals who are keen on human rights and so forth, is a very apt one, because Tony Abbott is one of those classic instances where Australia joining the United States in spreading the glory of human rights gets rather upset when other institutions instruct Australia and the Australian government that perhaps they are not particularly good with certain human rights observances in terms of, for example, asylum seekers. This is the classic problem here. Australia is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and a host of other international conventions. And in fact, the situation with Abbott was a rather peculiar one, because he attacked the Australian Human Rights Commission, which is designated as a government body that, to monitor observance of human rights in Australia. So the attack by Tony Abbott on Juan Mendez and the rapporteur is symptomatic, if you like, of a broader contempt about the idea that, as he said, being lectured to, but more broadly speaking, that Australia has to modify, quite frankly, this idea that its sovereignty is unquestioned when it comes to dealing with refugees.
Let's turn to the treatment of other marginalized communities, the Indigenous or Aboriginal people in Australia, who have a similar history of genocide and oppression, of erasure of their culture and language as Indigenous communities do in North America. Against this historical backdrop, how do you explain the treatment by the Abbott government of many of these communities? He has moved to try to cut social services and made these very contemptuous remarks, saying that they choose to live in these remote areas, and so it's just not worth the taxpayer expense to provide them with services. I mean, this was their land originally.
Yes, it's problematic. This notion about choice, of course, is very much part of the language of the neoliberal idea that supposedly we all have particular choices we can make, and by virtue of that we have to deal with the consequences of that. But this is actually very silly for many reasons. You've pointed out yourself precisely that individuals who have been living in parts of remote Australia, Australia being a huge country and having, of course, considerable remoteness to it, has this eternal problem of trying to juggle appropriate services and access. There are some Aboriginal communities that do, and this is no exaggeration. There is a certain almost third world status to some of them, and that's one of the disgraces, if you like, that occupies the Australian policy landscape. But what typifies this is the paternalism of the Abbott government, but also governments before, that is to say that there needs to be controls about spending, quarantining, welfare, and things like that. And we saw that under the Howard government, the Conservative Howard government, when it came to the so-called emergency in the Northern Territory, which is a particular regime where in the Northern Territory of Australia, literally the entire territory was subjected to very strict controls about welfare, quarantining of payments, and of course, the actual involvement of the military in the context of Aboriginal welfare, which is astonishing.
I mentioned earlier that Abbott is, of course, also very much marked by his extreme views on climate change. He set Australia back so many years in climate-friendly policies. There are now plans for the country's biggest coal mine, called Carmichael, to be established on Aboriginal lands, and there are many groups that are fighting it. Are Indigenous communities in Australia also on the front lines of being impacted by climate change and by fossil fuel use in general?
Well, yes, absolutely. It's very significant that the pursuit of the commodities industry in Australia does have significant impacts on the local populace, and of course, in particular parts of remote Australia, where the mining industry is very active. Individuals, the custodians and indigenous populations are heavily affected. When you mentioned the Carmichael project, currently there is a dispute taking place about whether it will go ahead. The challenges being put forth, by the Wangan and the Jagalingu people, and these particular individual custodians are challenging the legitimacy of the project using native title legislation, which is in place. But what is, of course, happening is that the particular response by the Carmichael mine, which is also run by other external interests, including an Indian company, they're arguing that the particular Aboriginal voices that are being made, if you like, in the context of this mine are not legitimate. And that's the great problem that tends to happen with indigenous populations. We see that in the United States and Canada as well, where the question is who's speaking for whom and what are the economic interests involved here and what are the benefits arising from this. And this is something that, of course, Mr. Cole, otherwise Tony Abbott, has exploited to the hilt. It's this idea that he's under no, he's not interested at all with the climate change debate. Quite frankly, he's interested in seeing how the mineral industry can exploit the environment.
Well, finally, are there domestic political forces in Australia that are hopeful of ending Abbott's tenure? In other words, is he Australia's George W. Bush, and is there hope for undoing the damage that he has done in so many arenas?
To a large extent, let's dealing with the issue of the opposition, many of his own party, for example, within his own party, the Liberal National Coalition, there is a fear that he has gone too far, that he is too extreme, that he is essentially a reactionary and a fundamentalist figure. Some weeks ago, there was, in fact, a leadership spill which was designed to test. It was initiated by his own party members. It was designed to test his popularity. And it was evident from the numbers that 40% of his party were not pleased, quite frankly, with this performance. He has an authoritarian style. He's got a very closed shop when it comes to consultation. And the reality of it is that he acts as if he's in opposition. That's the criticism. So when it comes to his critics, he has critics within his party and without his party as well. Then, generally speaking, when it comes to the legacy about what he will leave, the sad thing about it is that there is a general consensus across the major political parties about aspects of what he does. The problem rather is going to be placing Australia back on a track of climate change policy that is constructive and an acceptance that its foreign engagements are flawed and severe and so forth. But that, unfortunately, is not just an Abbott problem, it's an Australian problem.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and helping shed some light on this issue, and also appreciate the late hour at which you're doing this interview. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Binoy Kampmark is a senior lecturer at the School of Global Urban and Social Studies, teaching within the Bachelor of Social Science in the Legal and Dispute Studies program of a university in Australia. He writes for counterpunch.org. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. And Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising.